Hey everyone, Wee-Yeong here. As I record this devotional, we're less than a week from the sudden and very sad passing of my father-in-law, Rita's dad, and we're grieving. We are processing the shock and the sudden nature of this, and we're going through the process of fondly remembering his life and honoring his life. And I wanted to take a moment to reach out to those of you that have lost a loved one at any stage in your life, and in particular those that have lost loved ones over the last 18 months of this global pandemic. I wanted to share my journal entry from my reading of the book of Psalms, in particular Psalm 23 this week, and I hope it blesses you. As I meditated and reflected on the whole of Psalm 23 again, I can't help but see these words. The Lord is my. He makes me. He leads. You are with us. Your rod and your staff. You prepare. You anoint. And the only phrases that describes our part in this or our response are, I will fear no evil. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I experienced so much comfort in reading this, that God is the great initiator, that He is active, not passive. And I'm so grateful that my only reasonable response to His initiative is trust. Maybe some days or some hours I don't feel like it. Maybe sometimes I think upon our grieving and we think to the Lord, God, this is not fair. Theologian Gordon Fee refers to Psalm 23 as a song of trust. He explains that even in times of despair, God's goodness and care for His people ought to be expressed. I love the Psalms. Hebrew poetry by its very nature was addressed to the mind through the heart. In this time of sadness and grieving, the only thing I can do is to reflect on God's power, His love, and His active initiative in our relationship with Him. Psalm 23 uses imagery and metaphors, in particular the metaphors of a shepherd and that of the host of a feast. I found it interesting that David swaps roles and takes on the metaphorical role of a sheep. Being a shepherd, David would have understood full well the nature of a relationship between a sheep and its shepherd. He would have understood how helpless his sheep often are, and his understanding would have been first-hand and not theoretical. I believe that this understanding strengthened David's trust in the Lord in the midst of his troubles, that David knew that the heart of the shepherd is for the good of its sheep, even though the sheep has no idea what is going on. As I considered verse 5, I was struck by David's use of the metaphor of the hosts. My understanding of the role of a host is to celebrate an occasion and the pleasure and to provide pleasure to his guests. Our host would sit with his guests and enjoy lavish food and drinks and enjoy lots of fun times. What stood out for me, though, and deeply moved me was the thought that God desires to have pleasure and to celebrate with Him in His presence. I must admit that I don't often think of God in that way. Perhaps it's due to my cultural upbringing. Often I've not allowed myself to consider pleasure as one of God's desires for us. How about you? Even though He loves us dearly. What a revelation and a gentle rebuke. What was also an interesting observation was that God prepared the feast in the presence of David's enemies. God didn't destroy or remove His enemies, but rather celebrated David, almost paraded him in the presence of his enemies. This helps me consider the reality of life, that often our sufferings, our obstacles, our enemies, our frustrations, our tiredness, all of these things are ever present, but God celebrates us nonetheless, and He prepares a feast for us. He anoints us lavishly and brings overflowing to our lives. Truly, it's God's presence that brings us peace, not the absence of trouble. So as I come to conclude, I'm so grateful for this psalm in our season of grieving. It's reminded me of the power of His presence, that He walks through the valley of the shadow of death with me, and I will fear no evil, for He is with me. His rod and His staff, they comfort me. God bless you.